The acoustics of a ballroom change the moment gunfire replaces music. Bria Dalton learned this at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, pressed flat behind a Steinway Model D concert grand piano while bullets tore through the gilded plasterwork above her head. But 40 minutes earlier, her only problem had been keeping her sustained pedal technique invisible from the event coordinator who thought background pianists should be felt and not seen. She had been playing for rich people her entire adult life. It was a skill she'd developed alongside her formal training, not listed on any conservatory syllabus, but essential. How to make yourself disappear while your hands did the work. How to observe everything from a position nobody thought to watch. Tonight, she needed to stop disappearing. The Meridian Grand's East Ballroom had been rented out for a private fundraiser benefiting something called the Chicago Cultural Preservation Alliance, which, based on the guest list Bria had memorized from the posted seating chart 2 hours before doors opened, had no particular interest in culture or preservation. It was a gathering of men who traded in influence, silence, and things that didn't appear on any official ledger. She had played 3 events like this at the Meridian and understood the etiquette. Don't make eye contact. Don't listen too carefully. Don't let your tempo falter when someone whispers something that would make a normal person's hands shake. Bria's hands had stopped shaking 6 months ago. That was when she'd stopped being a normal person and started being someone who studied offshore banking structures at 2 in the morning, using her late father's pay stubs and a spreadsheet she'd taught herself to build from YouTube tutorials. Her father, Howard Dalton, had spent 19 years working facilities management for Caro Holdings, one of the legitimate facing arms of an organization whose actual reach nobody in law enforcement had successfully mapped. He had been a quiet man, good at his job, trusted enough to overhear things and intelligent enough never to repeat them. When he died 18 months ago, a heart attack, fast, no warning, Bria had flown home from a touring gig in Boston to help her mother sort through the paperwork. That was when she'd found the discrepancies. The pension, the severance, the quarterly profit-sharing distributions that Caro Holdings had apparently promised long-term employees and then quietly redirected through a subsidiary called Meridian Asset Partners into an account registered in the Cayman Islands. Not a lot of money by the standards of the men in this room, but for a family that had counted on it, for a younger sister named Lottie, who at 23 needed spinal surgery that their collapsed insurance plan wouldn't cover. $74,000 was the difference between walking and not walking again. Bria had been to 3 banks. She had consulted a lawyer who took $500 she didn't have and told her the paper trail was too complex for standard channels. She'd written 2 letters, one to the Illinois Attorney General's office, one to a journalist, and received polite responses suggesting the matter required more evidence than she currently possessed. What she possessed, instead, was a memory that her conservatory professor had called frankly unsettling in its precision, and 6 months of teaching herself to read the financial architecture of shell companies the same way she read a Bach partita, by understanding that every sequence had a logic, every deviation meant something, every number was in relationship to every other number. She'd found the pattern, she knew the routing codes, she knew the name on the trust. Vincent Arlen, Managing Director of Strategic Investments for Caro Holdings, a man who had sent a sympathy card when her father died. She also knew from a combination of careful research and the unfortunate reality of being a pianist for hire in Chicago's private events circuit that Vincent Arlen answered to Dante Caro, and that Dante Caro would be at table 7 tonight. She had never planned to be brave. Brave was a word that belonged to people with options. Dante Caro occupied table 7 the way a storm front occupied a weather system. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of atmospheric weight that altered everything around it. He was younger than she'd expected from the fear his name generated. Mid-30s, dark-haired, angular, in a way that suggested the suit had been built around a body that had survived things suits weren't designed for. He wasn't laughing at the jokes being told 2 tables over. He wasn't scanning the room for threats either. That was what the 4 men stationed at various points around his position were doing. He was simply watching, with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that watching was enough. Bria had been observing him for 2 full sets. 70 minutes of repertoire she played on muscle memory, while her brain worked through the logistics of what she was about to do. She didn't have $74,000. She didn't have evidence clean enough to take to any authority that would act on it. What she had was the ability to play the routing code sequence, the specific 9-digit account numbers from the Meridian Asset Partners transfer records as a melody. She had transposed them weeks ago, working late with the spreadsheet open on one screen and notation software on the other, turning numbers into pitches according to a system she'd invented herself, each digit mapped to a scale degree. It was a sequence nobody would hear as anything but a strange, melancholy improvisation, unless they knew what they were listening for, unless they were the man who had authorized those transfers. She needed Dante Caro to hear it and understand that someone knew. She needed 30 seconds of his attention. At 11:05 p.m., during the natural break between her second and third sets, instead of stepping away from the piano for water and the designated pianist's bathroom break, Bria repositioned the bench 3 inches to the left, angling herself so that the instrument projected directly toward table 7 rather than diffusing into the room. Small adjustment. Nobody noticed. She began with 12 bars of Satie, soft, expected, invisible. The man at table 7 didn't look up. Then she shifted into the sequence. It wasn't beautiful, exactly. It was too angular for beauty, the intervals slightly wrong in the way that made listeners uncomfortable without understanding why. It climbed through the first 9-digit code, paused on a sustained note that corresponded to the account identifier, then descended through the second. She played it twice, with the subtle repetition of a composer establishing a motif. At the 4th bar of the second repetition, Dante Caro looked up. Not at the room, at her. His expression didn't change. Not in any way she could have described to someone else. But something shifted in the quality of his attention, and the man to his left, a broad-shouldered enforcer with close-cropped hair that Bria had already identified as his closest security, registered his employer's focus and turned to assess what had generated it. Bria finished the sequence, let it resolve into something more conventional, and kept playing. She felt Dante Caro watching her for the remaining 4 minutes of the set. When she stood to take her break, one of his men was already moving. His name was Harker, and he communicated primarily through the geometry of his presence, positioning his body between Bria and any exit route in a way that was technically not threatening, but absolutely was. Mr. Caro would like a word, he said. Bria had been rehearsing this moment for 6 weeks. Her voice, when she answered, surprised her with its evenness. I know he would. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in films, but in the subtle way of people with excellent peripheral awareness and no desire to be adjacent to whatever was happening near table 7. 2 of the event's security personnel noticed Harker and Bria's approach and immediately looked away. That said everything Bria needed to know about the actual power structure in this room. Dante Caro stood as she reached the table. She hadn't expected that. Men like this, men who had spent years being deferred to, generally didn't stand for a hotel's contract pianist in a slightly too formal dress bought at a consignment shop in Wicker Park. Sit down, he said. It was a low voice, unhurried, the kind that had learned not to need volume. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of what was going to happen. She sat. He sat across from her. Harker remained standing at a precise distance. Where did you learn that sequence? Dante asked. No preamble. No pretending he hadn't heard exactly what she'd played. My father worked for Caro Holdings for 19 years, Bria said. He died 18 months ago. What was left of his estate included 6 years of financial statements that I've spent a significant portion of the last year learning to read. Dante's dark eyes didn't move from her face. That's an unusual hobby for a pianist. I have a sister who can't walk without surgery that costs more than my entire year of income. Unusual hobbies become necessary. She kept her voice flat. Flat was safer than trembling and more convincing than forced calm. The money that should have gone to my father's pension, and to 37 other long-term Caro Holdings employees, was redirected through a subsidiary called Meridian Asset Partners into a private trust registered in the Cayman Islands. The trust is managed by a holding company in Delaware. The signatory on that company's articles of incorporation is not you. A pause. The jazz from the room's peripheral speakers continued its cheerful, irrelevant pace. "It's Vincent Arlen," she said, "your managing director of strategic investments. He's been running this for at least 4 years. The total siphoned exceeds $12 million. I have the routing codes, the account identifiers, and a paper trail I've reconstructed from your own company's public filings, combined with documents my father kept, because he was meticulous and didn't trust anything he didn't have a copy of." Dante Caro was quiet for a long moment. The room continued its oblivious performance around them. "You walked into a room full of people who would very much like to pretend I don't exist," he said, "and played my own financial data at me as a piano improvisation to tell me my CFO is stealing from me." $12 million and 37 families, Bria said. "Mine is one of the... I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because the only person in this building with both the authority and the reason to do something about it is you. I need my sister's surgery funded and the redirected pension disbursements restored. In exchange, I'll give you everything I've documented. And if I choose to simply solve my problem without addressing yours..." Bria had thought about this answer for a long time. "Then you'll have to explain that to yourself. I can't stop you, but I've sent copies of my documentation to 3 separate secure locations with instructions." She paused. "I'm not a threat, Mr. Caro. I'm a transaction. I came here to propose a fair one." Something moved in his expression. Not warmth, nothing that's straightforward, but a recalibration, the faint adjustment of a man encountering an unexpected variable. He opened his mouth to respond. That was when the east doors opened and the shooting started. Later, Bria would not be able to fully reconstruct the sequence of her own actions. What she remembered was the sound, not the shots themselves, but the shattering of the ornamental mirror above the door, the crystalline implosion that preceded the screaming by half a second, and then she was moving. She hit Dante Caro from the left side, throwing her shoulder into his arm and driving him sideways out of his chair. The table went with them. 2 shots carved through the space his torso had occupied a quarter second before. They hit the floor together, Bria's elbow cracking against marble hard enough to send white sparks across her vision. Dante had already assessed the room in the fraction of time between falling and landing. She could feel him shift under her, his body positioning in a way that put himself between her and the main line of fire. "How many?" he said, clipped flat. "I saw 2 at the east doors," Bria said. "The one on the right was wearing a hotel staff uniform. They had a bag." Harker and another guard were already returning fire from the north wall, using an overturned banquet table as cover. The room had dissolved into the specific chaos of 200 people discovering simultaneously that the exits were not safe. Screams, overturning chairs, the crash of a champagne tower, a woman in red falling and being immediately helped up by the person beside her. Bria had spent years navigating event spaces. She knew this one in the particular, granular detail of someone who had carried equipment through every corridor and taken every available shortcut. She knew things that Harker didn't know because Harker had come through the front. "Service corridor," she said, "behind the stage panel on the west wall. 3rd from the left. Looks like wainscoting, but it's a door. It goes to the freight elevator. The freight elevator goes to the loading dock." Dante looked at her for precisely 1 second. It was not a look that invited argument or decoration. It was the look of someone calculating reliability. "Move," he said. He kept her low and ahead of him, his hand at her shoulder blade. Not gripping, steering, as they crossed behind the piano and reached the west wall. Bria found the panel by touch, pressed the recessed latch at the bottom corner the way the head of venue operations had shown her when she'd asked about it 6 months ago, purely because she was the kind of person who asked about things like that. The panel swung inward. They went through. The service corridor was narrow and harshly lit with fluorescence and smelled of cleaning solution and old paint. Bria led. Her low heels were wrong for running but manageable if she stayed on the balls of her feet. Behind her, Dante moved with a controlled efficiency that suggested this wasn't his first time navigating an emergency through a building's utility infrastructure. Shots echoed from behind the door they'd come through. Then the heavy mechanical percussion of the freight elevator, arriving at their call. They were inside before anyone else reached them. Dante hit the button for the loading dock. The elevator descended with a lurch. The loading dock at midnight was dim and cold and smelled like the city's back-end reality. Dumpsters, idling engines, the faint copper edge of something Bria chose not to investigate. A black armored SUV sat beside the receiving bay. The driver's window was down, and the driver was slumped against it in a way that removed any ambiguity about his condition. Dante moved past her to check the vehicle. She stood back, heart hammering, hands gripped together to stop them from shaking, not entirely successful. "Can you drive stick?" She looked at him. Yes. Passenger side. He was already behind the wheel. The SUV's engine turned over with the quiet authority of very expensive engineering, and they were moving before Bria had fully processed the fact that she was fleeing a mass shooting in a dead man's car with the head of a crime syndicate. Chicago at midnight was still populated enough to provide cover. Dante drove without apparent urgency, precisely at the speed of traffic, making no moves that would invite attention. When your hands were steady and your mind was somewhere else entirely. Arlen was in the room, she said, because her brain had finally assembled the pieces. "I saw him at table 4. Dante said nothing. The shooters came through the east doors. The east doors require a staff keycard after 9 p.m. to open from outside. She'd noticed this because she always used the west entrance after 9 to avoid waiting for clearance. Arlen handles events coordination for the quarterly fundraisers. He'd have had access to staff credentials. "You're saying," he ordered the hit. Dante's voice was unchanged, processing. "I'm saying he knew you'd be at table 7, he knew the layout, and he has 12 million reasons to need you not to have this conversation with anyone." She kept her voice steady. "The diversion rate in the accounts accelerated 8 months ago if he's planning an exit, taking the money and disappearing. The only thing standing between him and that is you." Dante was quiet for several blocks. The city moved past the window in streaks of orange and white. "You built this case for 6 months, he said finally, alone." "Yes." "No legal training, no financial background. I have a very good memory and a lot of insomnia." The ghost of something passed across his jaw. Not quite a smile. Nothing so human and unguarded as that, but the faint recognition of a man encountering a problem he hadn't anticipated and finding it against his better judgment interesting. "The safe house is on Wentworth," he said. "We'll want to go over everything you have." The apartment was not what Bria had imagined a crime syndicate's emergency refuge would look like. It was clean, spare, expensive in the understated way of someone with taste and no interest in display. Wide windows, dark furniture, a bank of monitors running encrypted feeds that Dante woke with a password sequence before Bria had finished removing her ruined shoes. He poured 2 glasses of something amber without asking. She drank hers without asking what it was. Vincent Arlen arrived 40 minutes later through a private elevator. His suit still pristine from the event, his expression arranged into the performance of a man who had survived something harrowing and was profoundly relieved to find his employer safe. He was 61, silver-haired, with the groomed authority of someone who had spent decades making other people trust him with their money. He stopped when he saw Bria. "Who is this?" The pleasantness in his voice was very good, nearly seamless. "Howard Dalton's daughter," Bria said. "He worked facilities management for 19 years. He died 18 months ago. You sent a sympathy card." Arlen's eyes moved to Dante, quick calculation quickly concealed. "I'm not sure what she—" "The Meridian Asset Partners Trust," Dante said. He hadn't moved from his position by the window. "The Delaware Holding Company, the Cayman accounts. Walk me through it." The quality of silence that followed was different from any silence Bria had sat in before. It had weight and edges. "That's a mischaracterization of a legitimate." "The routing codes she played tonight," Dante said. "At the piano. Did you recognize them?" The performance cracked. It happened in Arlen's eyes first, the pleasant professional overlay dissolving into the calculation underneath. He was working through options. Bria could see it the same way she could read a complicated harmonic structure and understand, in the first few bars, where the composer intended to go, and what would happen if the resolution never came. The access codes for the Meridian asset accounts match a security token registered to Arlen's personal device, Bria said, pulling her attention to Dante. "I found the token registration in the subsidiary filings, buried in the technical appendix. It's not visible unless you know what you're looking at." She paused. "I knew what I was looking at." "She's manufacturing evidence," Arlen said, his voice finally losing its warmth entirely. "She's a pianist. She doesn't know what any of." "Sit down, Vincent," Dante said. Something in the way he said it ended the sentence, and the room, and what remained of Arlen's composure. What happened in the next 20 minutes Bria watched from the edge of the room, her back against the window, her hands wrapped around the empty glass. Dante worked through it methodically. The documentation she provided from her bag, the digital files she'd emailed to his encrypted address at his instruction, the correspondence that Arlen eventually stopped denying and began attempting to reframe, in the diminishing way of someone who had believed until recently that they were too valuable to be made an example of. They were not, in the end, too valuable. Bria was looking at the window's dark reflection when it ended. She heard it and didn't turn around. She had grown up with limited means in a city where violence happened to people in her zip code, and she had learned young that there were certain moments you survived by going somewhere else inside yourself until they were finished. When she turned back, Dante was at the desk, closing a laptop with a precise click. "The pension disbursements will be restored to all 37 accounts within 10 days, he said. "Your sister's surgical costs will be covered directly. You'll receive a document with the terms." He looked at her, the same quality of attention she had felt from across the ballroom, measuring and precise and absent the social padding most people used to make appraisal comfortable. "You built a case against one of my most trusted advisors using document analysis, severance statements, and a melody you composed yourself. And then you walked it into a room where being wrong would have ended very badly for you." Bria set the glass on the windowsill. Her hands were mostly steady. "I didn't have a better option." "No, most people without better options still don't do that." He was quiet for a moment. "I need an analyst. Someone who finds what other people consider unfindable. Someone without a pattern that can be anticipated or bought." He crossed the room slowly, stopping at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. "The kind of person who hears $12 million in stolen money as a melody." Bria thought about the conservatory scholarship she had deferred, twice. About the catering gigs and the late nights and the spreadsheets that had taught her a second language she'd never intended to learn. About Lottie, who had gotten very good at making jokes about the wheelchair, because Lottie had always been better than she deserved at making the best of things. "That's a job offer," she said. "It's a statement of what I need," he extended his hand. "Not a demand, an acknowledgement. What it becomes is your decision." Bria looked at his hand. She thought about the kind of world she was considering stepping into, its gravity, its permanence, the door closing behind her with no handle on the inside. Then she thought about the sequence she'd played into the dark ballroom of the Meridian Grand. The melody nobody else in the room had understood. The sound of $12 million arranged into something that almost resembled music. She thought about the way Dante Caro had heard it from across a room full of powerful and oblivious people, and had looked up and had not looked away. She placed her hand in his. Outside, Chicago continued its complicated, relentless business, and Bria Dalton, who had spent her entire career perfecting the art of disappearing, stepped forward into something that would never let her vanish again. Whether that was a rescue or a reckoning, she was going to spend a very long time finding out, but for the first time in 18 months, it was her question to answer. If you want to see what Bria uncovers next inside Dante Caro's empire, drop a like and let us know. Share this with someone who loves a dark romance built on brains, not luck. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the most dangerous man in Chicago realizes the one person he can't control is also the one person he can't afford to lose. And tell us in the comments, did Bria make the right call, or did she just trade one kind of trap for another?